On April 13th, the United States Navy imposed a full blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. At roughly the same time, more than 200 Ukrainian soldiers were already operating inside Gulf countries, shooting down Iranian drones, not training Gulf forces, not advising them, doing it themselves. And here is the part that should make Washington uncomfortable. Nobody from the American government formally asked them to be there. Ukraine showed up, signed 10-year defense deals with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, deployed its people, and started destroying the exact same drones that are right now threatening American warships sitting stationary in a minefield. The country that 4 years ago needed the world's help to survive has become the country that the world is now quietly turning to for answers, including, whether they'll admit it or not, the United States. To understand why Ukraine is at the center of this crisis, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz crisis actually is, not the headline version, but what it means for real people on the ground. On February 28th, the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, coordinated strikes on Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and targeted nuclear infrastructure. Iran's immediate response was to close the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide waterway through which roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil normally passes every single day. Think about what that waterway closing actually looks like, not on a map, but in a shipping terminal. There are more than 600 vessels currently anchored and stranded in the Middle East Gulf region right now. Lloyd's List, which tracks maritime data, estimates that even if the strait reopened tomorrow, it would still take more than 10 days just to move the backlog out. Oil prices have nearly doubled. Jet fuel has spiked even higher. The financial damage to Arab countries alone has already been estimated at over $120 billion. And the mechanism Iran used to close it was not submarines or frigates. It was fast boats and drones. The IRGC positioned small attack craft across the strait, threatened to set fire to any ship attempting to cross without Iranian permission, and backed that threat up with Shahed drones, cheap, slow, and very hard to see until they're close. This is important because the Shahed drone has a specific signature that matters for this story. It flies low. It doesn't announce itself. It crosses the radar horizon late and at altitudes that confuse systems designed for faster, higher threats. Thomas Caraco, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, put it plainly to NPR, "The Shahed is not that hard to kill once you see it. The problem is seeing it in time." And in the early days of Operation Epic Fury, the United States did not always see it in time. In the first 3 days of the conflict alone, the U.S. reportedly fired 800 Patriot interceptor missiles at Iranian drones. Each Patriot missile cost between $3 and $4 million. Each Shahed cost somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 to build. The U.S. was spending roughly $100 for every dollar Iran spent on its offensive. That math, as we'll see, is exactly where Ukraine comes in. Here's the structural problem the United States walked into, and it's worth being precise about because it's the same trap that Ukraine spent the first 2 years of the war trying to escape. When you're the defender against a cheap drone threat, the economics destroy you. Iran builds a Shahed for $20,000 to $50,000. You fire a Patriot missile worth $4 million to knock it out of the sky. Do that 800 times in 3 days, and you've spent over $3 billion defending against an attack that cost Iran a fraction of that. And while you're burning through your most expensive interceptors, the attacker simply builds more drones. Ukraine knows this trap intimately. At the peak of Russia's drone campaign, Russia was firing more than 6,000 Shaheds at Ukraine per month. Ukraine calculated that if it relied solely on Western missile interceptors to stop them, the monthly bill would have exceeded $25 billion. The country obviously didn't have $25 billion a month. So it had to find another way. That other way became one of the most important military innovations of the last decade. Over 3 years of constant, desperate problem-solving, Ukraine built an entirely new category of air defense, the interceptor drone. Small, cheap, fast enough to chase a Shahed down, and guided by a soldier wearing FPV goggles who can see what the drone sees in real time. Ukraine's Sting interceptor, for example, costs somewhere between $300 and $200 to build. It is faster than a Shahed. It can catch one, ram it, and detonate. For the cost of a single Patriot missile, Ukraine can put 3,000 interceptor drones in the air. By January of this year, Ukraine was deploying 40,000 interceptors per month. It can now produce around 1,500 per day. And here is the number that defines how effective they've become. In March, Ukrainian interceptors alone accounted for roughly 70% of all Russian Shaheds destroyed. Not Patriot missiles. Interceptor drones that cost less than a business-class plane ticket. Ukraine essentially solved the problem that the United States is right now facing in the Strait of Hormuz. But there's a more recent development that makes all of this even more urgent. Iran has been deploying a new variant of the Shahed, the Shahed 238, which uses a jet engine instead of a propeller. This version travels at 300 to 500 kilometers per hour. It is harder to detect, harder to catch, and leaves an even shorter window for interception. The U.S., as far as public record shows, has no dedicated low-cost answer to it. Ukraine does. Ukrainian Sting drones downed their first jet-powered Shahed back in November 2025. Zelensky announced just last week that Ukraine is now moving toward mass production of a new generation of interceptor specifically designed for jet-powered threats. The U.S. is fighting the right war with the wrong economics. Ukraine has already rebuilt those economics from scratch. And while Washington has been slow to acknowledge this, the rest of the region has not waited around for American permission to act. Here's the turn in this story. And it's a striking one. Ukraine did not wait to be invited. It built the product, proved it worked, and went and sold it to the people who needed it most. In early March, Zelensky visited the Gulf. He signed 10-year defense agreements with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, countries that have been taking Iranian Shahed strikes to their infrastructure, their industrial cities, their ports. He then deployed over 200 Ukrainian military specialists into those countries, not to train, but to operate. Within weeks, those specialists were actively shooting down Iranian drones. Zelensky confirmed it publicly and directly. Quote, "Did we destroy Iranian Shaheds? Yes, we did. Did we do it in just one country? No, in several." Britain's Armed Forces Minister Al Carnes, who visited Kiev on April 11th, said plainly that Ukraine has some of the best drone technology in the world and that it is already providing utility in the Middle East against Shahed drones. He said it as a statement of established fact, not a hope or a recommendation. So to be clear about what has actually happened, while the U.S. has been debating whether it needs Ukraine's help, Ukraine has already moved, it deployed, it signed deals, it shot down the enemy's drones, and it got paid for it, not in cash, but in crude oil, diesel, and air defense components for its own home front. Ukraine turned its battlefield knowledge into a functioning export. The question now is whether America will be the last customer to figure that out. Let's get specific about what Ukraine is actually offering, because the picture is broader than most coverage suggests. Start with the interceptor drones, since those are the most immediate answer to the Shahed problem. Think of them the way you'd think of a dedicated goalkeeper versus a generalist defender. A Patriot missile battery is extraordinarily capable. It can handle ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, aircraft, but using it against a slow, low-flying Shahed is like deploying a Formula One car to make a grocery run. It works, but it's catastrophically wasteful, and you only have so many. An interceptor drone is built for one thing: finding that specific kind of threat, chasing it down, and destroying it at a fraction of the cost. Ukraine has spent 3 years engineering that interceptor to be as cheap, as fast, and as scalable as possible. It can offer Gulf states and potentially the U.S. up to 1,000 of these per day. But Zelensky hasn't just brought interceptors to the Gulf. On April 14th, he unveiled a catalog of 56 weapon systems that Ukraine has developed domestically during the war. 31 drones, 7 missile systems, 4 electronic warfare tools, 6 robotic ground platforms, 3 unmanned naval systems, and a mobile air defense turret. Almost everything on that list has a direct application to the threat environment in and around the Strait of Hormuz. The unmanned naval systems are particularly relevant right now. The U.S. Navy announced this past weekend that it is using underwater drones to clear Iranian sea mines from the strait, mines that Iran laid and, according to U.S. officials, can no longer fully locate itself. Ukraine has been running a comparable operation in the Black Sea for over 2 years. In 2023, when Russia blockaded Ukraine's ports and threatened any ship that tried to leave, Ukraine did not wait for the blockade to lift. It created what became known as the Food Security Corridor, organizing convoys of civilian vessels, using armed surface drones to suppress Russian naval threats, and keeping shipping moving despite the blockade. As a Ukrainian commander told Euronews, "We organized convoys for civilian vessels using sea drones to counter Russian helicopters and other offensive weaponry." That is almost exactly the operational challenge the U.S. now faces in the Strait of Hormuz. And then there's the electronic warfare dimension, which rarely gets the attention it deserves. A significant part of Ukraine's success against Shahed drones is not just shooting them down, it's jamming their navigation. Ukraine has developed EW systems capable of confusing drone guidance systems so effectively that Shaheds lose their targeting and crash on their own. In the confined geography of the strait, where Iranian fast boats and drones operate close to the Iranian coast, with very short flight times to their targets, that kind of electronic suppression could be decisive. Ukraine has also shown its willingness to structure these partnerships intelligently. Zelensky's government-to-government model, the G2G framework, means Ukraine establishes the intergovernmental trust relationship first, then follows it with commercial and operational agreements. It's not just selling hardware, it's embedding itself as a long-term security partner. The Gulf states understood this quickly. The deals signed with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE are 10 years long. Ukraine is also in active talks with Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain. It is constructing a security architecture in the Middle East, built on exactly the expertise the current crisis demands, and it is doing so faster than any Western alliance has managed to organize. Let's zoom out, because the implications of what Ukraine is doing extend well beyond this specific conflict. The first implication is geopolitical, and it's the one that will matter most in Washington if anyone is paying attention. Ukraine is demonstrating that a country can transition from aid recipient to security provider faster than anyone expected, and it is using that transition to build leverage. The Gulf deals are not charity. Ukraine receives crude oil, diesel, air defense components, and financial arrangements in return. Zelensky framed it explicitly. Ukraine is strengthening the Gulf's security in exchange for contributions to Ukraine's own resilience. That is not the language of a dependent country. That is the language of an ally negotiating from strength. The second implication is military-industrial, and it challenges a foundational assumption about how defense works. For most of the last century, the assumption has been that the countries with the biggest defense budgets produce the best weapons. Ukraine is systematically dismantling that assumption. Its interceptor drone costs as much as 66 times less than the cheapest comparable American alternative. Its naval drones have demonstrated capabilities that have surprised military analysts across NATO. And it has done all of this under live fire, refining every system in real combat conditions that no testing range can replicate. Britain's Armed Forces Minister said it directly: Ukraine has developed battle-tested knowledge that money alone cannot buy. The arms market is noticing. Russia's arms exports have fallen 64% over the last 5 years. Ukraine's are rising. The third implication is the one that may be the most uncomfortable for the Trump administration specifically. Trump has publicly stated that the U.S. doesn't need Ukraine's help on drone defense. He rejected Ukraine's offer of interceptor expertise in March and turned down a proposed trade, Ukrainian interceptors for Patriot missiles. But the situation on the ground has continued to evolve without waiting for a deal to be struck. Ukraine is already operating in the Gulf. Britain has already organized discussions among more than 30 nations on Hormuz security that include Ukrainian participation. The ceasefire between the US and Iran is fragile. It collapsed once already when Iran refused to reopen the strait, and drone strikes against Gulf states continued even during the truce. Every day that passes without a formal US-Ukraine agreement on drone defense is a day the US is either using $4 million Patriot missiles to knock down $30,000 drones, or it's relying on the fact that Ukraine is already solving the problem next door without American involvement. Neither of those is a sustainable or strategically coherent position, and the clock matters here. Iran still has thousands of Shaheds in reserve according to US intelligence, even after weeks of strikes on its production facilities. The threat has not been extinguished. There is one more thing worth noting. Ukraine has offered, repeatedly and publicly, to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz by sharing its Black Sea corridor expertise. As of last week, Zelensky confirmed that no formal request had come from the US or key partners. Ukraine is quite literally offering the blueprint and waiting for someone to pick up the phone. On April 13th, as the US Navy imposed its blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, over 200 Ukrainian soldiers were already in the Gulf, using drones built in Kharkiv and Kiev to shoot down the same Iranian weapons that Russia has been firing at Ukrainian cities for 3 years. That is the full picture, not a country asking for help, a country providing it, to the Gulf states, to the broader security architecture that Britain is now trying to organize, and potentially, if Washington can get past the politics, to the United States itself. Putin invaded Ukraine to erase it. Instead, he forced it to become one of the most innovative military powers on Earth. And the bitter irony is that the drones Iran gave to Russia, which Russia fired at Ukraine by the tens of thousands, are now the reason Ukraine has a seat at the table in every major security conversation on the planet. Ukraine solved the Shahed problem. The Strait of Hormuz is a Shahed problem. The only question remaining is whether America acts on that before the situation forces its hand or after. That's the story as it stands today. If you want to go deeper on how Ukraine's Black Sea corridor model could work in the Strait of Hormuz specifically, that's the next video. And if this kind of analysis is what you come here for, subscribing means you don't miss the follow-up.